So then, in terms of knowing your rights with ICE, this is a bunch of information on warrants. So as we've already talked about, only a court can issue a warrant to enter and search someone's house. And so that means that ICE would need a warrant signed by a judge. Similarly, this sort of answers your question, Steve, where it's factories, non-public areas of a store, high-rise buildings, farms, or orchards, for example, are all workplaces where ICE would also need a warrant signed by a judge because those are not like publicly accessible areas. However, ICE could get permission from the owner or manager to enter a workplace, and so that is, relevant to people who work somewhere who may or may not have an employer who's willing to collaborate with ICE or not. If ICE gets permission to enter, they can ask employees any questions about their immigration status. However, obviously, if people are asked questions about their immigration status, they can remain silent. If the employer does not allow ICE entry into the workplace, ICE would have to get a warrant to be able to enter. So they can't, much like at home, they cannot force entry without a warrant. In public locations, an ICE arrest warrant allows ICE officers to arrest people who are not citizens who are suspected of violating immigration laws. So there's a bunch of different kinds of ICE warrants. There's a removal warrant, arrest warrant, etc. Really the most important thing to know here is that ICE can't use any warrant except for a warrant signed by a judge to enter a home or a workplace. If they are just arresting somebody with no reasonable suspicion, then they often do actually need an arrest warrant to say you are this person who we've been looking for. But if they know that it's that person because they've just gone to their court hearing and heard them say that it's them and they know they're undocumented, ICE could arrest them without an arrest warrant.
Is a church private or public?
Private. Well, church services are more public, but I think sort of as Kathy said, if you are not going to the church for church business, for church services, then you could be considered trespassing because the church is private property. So then, in terms of in a car, cars are really tricky, and I'm always, there's a lot of different rules around ICE and cars, but ICE can stop a car if they reasonably suspect that the vehicle contains undocumented people. This has to be based on specific objective facts aside from physical appearance. So it can't just be around hunch, but there has to be for example, that ICE often ICE will know where somebody lives, but not feel like they could obtain a judicial warrant, so they'll wait for somebody to drive out of their house and then detain them in their car because they know that it's that person. They know for sure that it's that person, and they don't need a judicial warrant in order to detain somebody in that situation. Once a vehicle is stopped, ICE can briefly question occupants about their immigration status, and sort of you have the same rights regardless of citizenship status. If you're stopped and questioned by law enforcement, so that means you always have the right to remain silent. You have the right to record the incident. You don't have to answer any questions about your immigration status, and you don't have to consent to a search. They really the summary here is that ICE has to have reasonable suspicion in order to stop a car. In addition, both ICE and police can validly search a vehicle on a public highway without a warrant if there's probable cause. So if a police person stopped you in your car and they could see a gun on your back seat, that would be probable cause to search your car. Or if they had talked to you enough to have reasonable suspicion that you were involved in a crime, then they could search your car. Related to ICE, they need to have sufficient facts available so that if they were trying to obtain a warrant to search your car, then they would be successful. So this includes basically anything in the car, including passenger belongings. I think sort of the summary of all of this is like that if you are stopped in your car by ICE, if somebody's stopped in their car by ICE, then they should remain silent, they should remain calm, they should refuse to answer questions about immigration status if they feel that would be incriminating, and if somebody in the car has the capacity to record what's going on, then that is a good idea. However, people are often detained in their cars because they are, like, ICE and police both often have slightly more discretion around cars because cars are like, well, because there's like a lot of regulations around cars to begin with, and it's different than just walking down the street or being in your home. So with regard to sensitive locations, you all probably know a little bit about this already because we're in a sensitive location, but basically that means that supervisory official at DHS has to have, like, given approval for ICE to search or enforce in any particular, to enforce, not search, any particular place. So this includes schools, hospitals, places of worship, sites of funerals, or public religious ceremonies, sites of public demonstrations. So all of those are sensitive locations. Courthouses are not sensitive locations, but there's actually a lot of legal action going on right now to try to make them sensitive locations. We'll see what happens there, but I would say that's been an ongoing conversation. There is one exception to this general rule, which is that ICE can enforce in sensitive locations without prior approval if there's an issue of national security or terrorism, an imminent risk of death, violence, or harm to any person or property. Enforcement action involves the immediate arrest or pursuit of somebody who they consider a dangerous felon, or an imminent risk of destruction of evidence material in an ongoing criminal case. I don't think any of those really apply, certainly in the current sanctuary situation, and like probably would not apply in most sanctuary situations. But worth noting, like when sensitive locations can be entered by ICE. So just brief information on harboring, which is something that I think a lot of people hear and get pretty nervous about. So harboring is basically if you're concealing or shielding or attempting to conceal or shield undocumented immigrants from detection by authorities, when done like with specific regard to the person's documentation status. So this basically means like if you were allowing someone to stay in your house with the express purpose of evading detection by ICE, or driving somebody expressly for the purpose of getting away from ICE or something like that. Or for example, like if you were accompanying somebody to court and ICE was pursuing them and you were like, here, just get in my car really quickly, that would be considered harboring. However, there is sort of an intent requirement, which means that the prosecutor would have to prove that you or your organization was like really intending to shelter somebody with the express purpose of evading ICE. However, if immigration authorities know somebody's whereabouts, that like providing shelter or transportation shouldn't create any sort of liability. So like here at the church, ICE obviously knows who's staying here, and so that doesn't, there's also slightly different things with churches, but this is sort of more applicable to like you as an individual or if you're driving somebody somewhere. There's been a whole lot of different rulings around harboring across the country. A lot of different circuit courts have really different opinions of what constitutes harboring. However, definitely like worth consulting a lawyer on this issue if you're an organization considering providing sanctuary, but also like if you as an individual aren't sure about, you know, how you're interacting with, how different organizations you're a part of are interacting with providing transportation or housing to folks who aren't documented and want to avoid harboring. Obviously, again, this is not necessarily a condemnation of sometimes needing to take actions that are like not always what you might legally be supposed to do, but more to be really clear about what the risks are, and that both harboring and obstructing ICE action are federal crimes. So they're pretty serious. So then very briefly, what to do if you're stopped by ICE. This sort of goes over, I think, mostly already things that I've already talked about, which is like you have the right to remain silent, and it's best not to lie about your citizenship or provide fake documents. If you're stopped in your car, turn off the car, turn on the internal light, place your hands on the wheel. You can ask if you're free to leave if you're a passenger, write down what you remember and take pictures if you can. If ICE officers come to your door, keep the door closed and ask if they're from ICE. Ask for an interpreter if your language isn't being spoken. If agents want to enter, ask if they have a warrant signed by a judge. If they don't, you can refuse to open the door. If they say if they have the warrant, ask them to slip it under the door or to put it up against a window so that you can see it without opening your door. As you've already seen what those warrants look like, and I'll send them out, and you can then sort of understand what you should be looking for. Don't open your door unless this warrant is shown that specifically names a person in your residence and or areas to be searched at your address. In all other cases, keep the door closed, and we advise people to call the More support line. They can also call a lawyer or anybody else they might have who might be able to help in the situation. If agents force their way into the house, don't resist, but everybody has the right to remain silent in this situation. And one thing that's been asked at previous trainings like this is what to do if you live in an apartment, like if you lease an apartment or a house and you don't own where you live. And the answer there is that it's whoever is the resident of where you're living, like, has the right to refuse entry. It's not the landlord who would have right to like give or refuse entry. And so even if actually there's like you're paying your rent under the table and there aren't receipts, like if it is clear that you are the person living on the premises, then you are the person who has the right to say you can't come in. So
sorry, does that apply to ICE and the police, or just?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, that applies to either.